Okay, so you're trying to get a handle on some pretty complex stuff, right? Like this whole US-China trade situation. You want the real story, the key points, without, you know, wading through endless reports.
Exactly. And that's what we're aiming for here. Think of this as your shortcut. We've dug through a whole stack of sources, economic reports, diplomatic analyses, news articles, to pull out the essential insights and maybe some surprising facts too.
Yeah, the stuff that makes you go, aha, ooh. So today, it's all about the US-China trade conflict. We're looking at the tariffs, those export restrictions, especially on rare earths and critical minerals, and, well, what it all means.
hmm And we've looked at a real variety of sources, trying to get different angles on this. Economic perspectives, diplomatic takes, how it's actually playing out for businesses.
Right. So the mission today, basically understand where things stand now, why certain actions were taken, and what the ripple effects might be across different sectors. We'll keep it focused, hitting those key moments of clarity. Okay, so where did this current phase really pick off?
Well, a key moment. You really have to go back to Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. A big promise was tackling the trade deficit with China, reducing it.
And the stated reasons for wanting to do that were pretty clear. Things like unfair trade practices, intellectual property theft, that was a huge one, and the feeling that U.S. companies just didn't have fair access to the Chinese market.
Precisely. And the proponents of tariffs, the people in the U.S. who supported them, they argued this would do a few things. They thought it could bring manufacturing jobs back home, that we needed reciprocal tariffs, basically, matching what China did, and of course eliminate that trade deficit. Plus, pushing for changes in China's IP rules and investment policies.
It's interesting, though, because when you talk to most economists, they're often a bit skeptical about tariffs achieving those first three goals. Not necessarily dismissing the underlying issues, but questioning if tariffs are the right tool, right?
That's a very common view, yeah. Because tariffs are essentially taxes on imports. And often it's the importing companies, American companies, and ultimately consumers who bear the cost. So the link to creating jobs isn't always direct, especially with complex global supply chains.
And you have stats like, back in 2019, U.S. exports to China supported something like 1.2 million American jobs. Plus, Chinese firms here employed nearly 200,000 Americans. It's not a one-way street.
Not at all. The economies are deeply intertwined, and the dominant view among economists tends to be that the U.S. trade deficit is more about bigger macroeconomic factors, things like national savings rates versus investment, than just trade policy itself.
Okay, so we had this initial push, these justifications, and then things started to heat up, didn't they? It became what people call a trade war.
Yeah, it really escalated into that kind of tit-for-tat cycle. The U.S. puts tariffs on Chinese goods, China retaliates with tariffs on U.S. goods, and that cycle has continued. I mean, look at the recent hikes in 2025. The U.S. imposing tariffs up to, what, 145% on some things?
Wow, 145%? That's massive.
It's a huge cost increase for anyone importing those goods.
And China fired back too, raising tariffs to 125% on certain American products. We saw that example of an aluminum coating factory suddenly facing a 75% total tariff to sell into the US. That's potentially business ending.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And China didn't just use tariffs. They targeted specific U.S. exports, agriculture being a really big one. Remember back in 2019, the U.S. also labeled China a currency manipulator.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Another layer of tension.
Exactly. It added another dimension to the conflict, suggesting the U.S. believed China was deliberately keeping its currency value low to gain an edge in trade.
And it's crucial to remember who actually pays these tariffs, right? It's often U.S. companies importing the goods, and those costs can get passed right down the line to consumers.
That's the standard economic understanding. And there were warnings about broader impacts pretty early on. The Tax Policy Center, back in 2019, projected the trade war could wipe out, quote, most or all of the benefits from the big tax cuts for lower and middle income families.
So one government policy potentially canceling out another.
Essentially, yes. And it wasn't just them. Morgan Stanley, also in 2019, warned that the ongoing trade war could actually tip the economy into a recession. So the stakes were seen as quite high.
Now, there's also a perspective I've seen suggesting maybe China's leadership miscalculated slightly, overestimated their economic standing relative to the U.S.
Yeah, that's an argument some observers make, the idea of power parity, that China felt it was economically on par with the U.S.
Hmm.
But this view holds that a full decoupling, a complete separation of the economies, could actually be much more damaging for China than perhaps they initially thought.
Okay, let's pivot slightly to something really critical in this whole dynamic. rare earth elements, and other key minerals. These seem to be increasingly central.
They absolutely are.
Yeah.
China has put export restrictions on some of these materials.
Hmm.
And you have to see this in context. It's widely viewed as retaliation for U.S. actions, like the tariffs, and also earlier restrictions the Biden administration put on minerals and semiconductors flowing to China.
So it's another front in the trade conflict. And the U.S. is definitely aware of its dependence here, isn't it? There was that congressional committee report.
All right, the Select Committee on Strategic Competition. In 2023, they specifically recommended things like tax credits to encourage domestic production of rare earth magnets. It shows a clear strategic push to become less reliant on China for these.
But building that capacity takes time.
A lot of time. The report noted the U.S. has only really started building these capabilities in the last maybe 3 years or so.
Yeah.
There's a long way to go to catch up or achieve significant self-sufficiency.
Which makes these materials almost certain to be a major bargaining chip in any future U.S.-China talks, I'd imagine. The U.S. needs them.
It's a key point of leverage, no doubt. And this dependence impacts specific industries directly. Think about electric vehicles, EVs.
Right, because it's not just the general tariffs. There were already existing ones, like that 25% tariff on autos.
Exactly. And EVs need batteries, lots of them. And the critical minerals inside those batteries. Well, even if the battery itself isn't assembled in China, the raw materials or the processing often originates there or passes through China. So tariffs can hit at multiple points in the supply chain.
Which increases costs significantly for EV makers trying to compete.
Definitely. And that's partly why you see the U.S. looking to strengthen ties and potentially strike trade deals with allies, places like Japan, South Korea, India. Diversifying the sources for these critical minerals is a major goal. Building more resilient supply chains with friendly nations.
Okay, zooming out again. What about the international institutions like the World Trade Organization, the WTO? How does it fit into this? There seem to be frustrations there.
Yeah, there are significant concerns, particularly within the U.S., that the WTO's current rules just aren't equipped to handle the challenges posed by China's economic system.
What kinds of challenges specifically?
Things like massive state subsidies, the blurry line between state-owned enterprises and private companies. The U.S. Trade Representative's Office put out a report in 2022 basically saying WTO rules can't effectively discipline many of China's, quote, most harmful policies. And that view seems pretty widespread in Washington across both parties.
So the feeling is the rulebook needs an update or maybe isn't being enforced effectively.
Kind of both. The argument from the USTR is that this perceived inadequacy of the WTO has really shaped U.S. trade policy decisions. But then there's the counter-argument
Which is?
that if the U.S. actively undermines the WTO system, even out of frustration, it could backfire in the long run. The worry is it could weaken the whole rules-based international order that, frankly, the U.S. helped build and has benefited from. Some analysts fear it could inadvertently pave the way for, say, a period of Chinese dominance without effective global rules.
That's a complex balancing act. So, okay, we've talked about the motivations, the escalations, the specific sectors. What about the actual economic effects so far? Has the trade war achieved what proponents hoped?
Well, on the goal of bringing back manufacturing jobs to the U.S., the early evidence suggests not really. Several economic studies have looked into this, and they haven't found a significant boost in manufacturing employment directly linked to the tariffs.
Okay, so maybe not on jobs. What about the overall economy, like GDP?
Most studies point towards a negative impact, potential losses in U.S. GDP. They factor in the higher costs for consumers, the impacts on producers dealing with tariffs or retaliation, and how trade patterns shift globally.
I remember some early analyses suggesting import and export prices didn't jump hugely right away.
That's true. Some studies found initial price movements were relatively small, which might imply a limited first-order impact. But even then, they found that the changes in import volumes, companies buying less because of the tariffs or uncertainty, still resulted in overall economic losses. It's complicated.
And these global value chains make it even harder to predict, right? A tariff here can have ripple effects way down the line.
Exactly. It can lead to long-lasting, sometimes unexpected shifts in where and how things get made globally. It's not just a simple switch.
We also saw evidence in the stock market, didn't we? Companies more exposed to China saw their stocks dip when tariffs were announced back in 2018.
Yes, that suggests investors saw the risks associated with that exposure. It's also worth remembering, amidst all the focus on U.S.-China, that over 95% of world trade actually happens between other countries.
That's a great point. So Disruptions in this one relationship can still distort that much larger global picture.
Precisely. The ripple effects can be significant, even if the direct U.S.-China trade is only a fraction of the global total.
Okay, let's talk diplomacy for a moment. We call it a trade war, which sounds combative. It really is an economic conflict using trade barriers, often driven by protectionism, right?
That's a fair description. And you have the two sides. Proponents who believe these measures protect national interests, maybe shield domestic industries. Then critics argue that in today's interconnected world, it just ends up harming everyone, local companies, consumers, the broader economy.
I've heard the term positive peace mentioned as a possible alternative framework. What does that entail in this kind of context?
So positive peace isn't just the absence of conflict. It's about actively building the conditions for peace. Things like stronger international institutions, more transparency, fostering mutual respect. It's a framework for managing tensions constructively, aiming for long-term stability rather than just short-term wins or ceasefires.
And a key tool in that, presumably, is diplomatic negotiation, trying to find common ground.
Absolutely. Negotiation is fundamental. It's the process of trying to merge diverging interests, find solutions that both sides can live with. But, as our sources point out, it's often not easy.
What makes it difficult?
All sorts of obstacles can get in the way.
Hmm.
Sometimes the political environment just isn't right, trust is low, or the core disagreements are too deep. You might need a change in the overall context, some external event perhaps, to even get serious talks started or concluded.
But despite those hurdles, negotiation between states is still the main game in town for resolving disputes peacefully, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
It remains the central process in international relations for harmonizing interests when there's no overarching world government telling everyone what to do.
And arguably more effective than resorting to force, especially long term.
Generally, yes. Negotiation avoids the immense costs of conflict. And it's interesting how, compared to, say, the 17th or 18th centuries where warfare was often the go-to option, negotiation has become much more central in the 21st century for conflict resolution.
To make negotiation work, you really need to understand the context too, right? Who's involved? What are their real positions? What procedures are they following?
All of that matters hugely. The parties, their specific interests versus their stated positions, the setting, the procedures, it all shapes the outcome. And there's this interesting observation that international negotiations are becoming more influenced by domestic politics.
And domestic issues are getting more internationalized.
Exactly. The lines are blurring, which can make the traditional diplomat's job even more complex.
Now, despite all the tension, there have been some recent signs, maybe flickers of dialogue. I saw mentions of nice conversations between U.S. and Chinese officials in April 2025.
Yes, reports of Treasury Secretary Yellen having discussions in China, described in those terms. Small steps, perhaps, but dialogue nonetheless. And separate from China, there's also been talk about potential movement on the U.S.-EU trade front.
Oh, right, with Donald Trump expressing confidence about a deal and Italy's Prime Minister Meloni suggesting she could help bridge gaps.
That's correct. Trump apparently said he was 100% sure a deal would happen, and Meloni echoed that optimism, even mentioning Trump accepting an invite to Rome, potentially opening doors for talks with other European leaders. So it hints at potential shifts in the wider trade landscape, not just with China.
Okay, but bringing it back to China specifically, how do they frame all this? What's their narrative?
Well, when it comes to U.S. actions against companies like Huawei, for example, the Chinese perspective is generally that this isn't about genuine national security concerns, but rather it's protectionism. They see it as an attempt to stifle China's technological rise.
They argue the evidence for security risks is thin.
Often, yes. They argue it's motivated more by a desire to eliminate a strong competitor. And publicly, China tends to advocate for handling issues like cybersecurity or IP protection through international collaboration and negotiation within existing global frameworks.
And they often reiterate their policy of peaceful rise, don't they? Saying they don't seek global dominance.
They do. That's their official stance, contrasting it with how the U.S. sometimes portrays China as a revisionist power aiming to upend the current international order. So, quite different narratives.
Right. Okay, finally, let's touch on the very real impact all this has on supply chains. That must be incredibly challenging for businesses.
Oh, absolutely. Supply chain managers are facing huge amounts of uncertainty and disruption because of these trade wars. Tariffs can change, regulations can shift. It's very difficult to plan long term.
So what are they focusing on?
The big buzzwords are de-risking, resilience, and agility. Basically, trying to build supply chains that can better withstand shocks, whether it's a new round of tariffs, A pandemic, labor issues, whatever. Diversification is key.
And with new tariffs kicking in, like those on March 4th, 2025, they're constantly having to react and adjust their strategies.
Constantly. And we're seeing concrete examples, like Chinese factories actively looking to grow their business outside the U.S. market because the tariffs are just making it too expensive or too unpredictable to sell here.
So, to try and wrap this up for our listeners, what are the main threads we've pulled out today?
Well, we started with the historical roots, right? Those campaign promises back in 2016, the stated reasons for tariffs. Then we traced the escalation, that tit-for-tat cycle, and highlighted the strategic importance of things like rare earths and critical minerals.
We also look at the economic analyses, the debates about job creation, the potential hits to GDP, how tariffs are actually paid. And we touched on the role and the perceived limits of institutions like the WTO, plus the very different perspectives coming from the US and China.
And we can't forget the diplomatic angle negotiation as a key tool, despite its challenges, and those recent hints of renewed dialogue, maybe even shifts in broader trade alliances.
hmm
So hopefully this deep dive gave you that clearer picture, hitting the crucial points without getting bogged down.
Absolutely. So, maybe a final thought to leave everyone with. In such a deeply interconnected global economy, considering all these complexities we've discussed, what really are the long-term consequences of leaning towards protectionism versus pushing harder for international cooperation and finding negotiated solutions? And maybe how will technology itself continue to change this whole game?
Lots to chew on there. We really encourage listeners to keep considering these different angles, the economic, the political, the diplomatic, as this U.S.-China relationship continues to evolve. It's definitely a story that's far from over.